Criminologists call it folie à deux, the folly of two, a clinical name for a phenomenon investigators have documented for over a century. Two people whose individual capacity for violence would, alone, have stayed buried, but who together became something neither one could have become apart. Killer couples are statistically rare. Of every documented serial murder case in the modern record, fewer than 5% involve a duo. But when they happen, they tend to be among the most prolific, the most brutal, and the most psychologically studied cases on file. There is almost always an instigator. There is almost always an accomplice. There is almost always a moment, identifiable in retrospect, where one of them could have stopped and didn't. This is every killer couple, explained in 16 minutes. Couple 1. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, the archetype that made killer couples a fixture of American imagination. Bonnie was a 19-year-old waitress from West Dallas with a missing husband already in prison for murder. Clyde was a 23-year-old petty criminal with a Texas penitentiary record. They met in January 1930 in a friend's kitchen. He was eating a sandwich. By April that same year, he was back in prison. By the time he was paroled in February 1932, the Great Depression had collapsed half the rural economy of Texas, and they began robbing it. Between 1932 and May 1934, the Barrow Gang killed at least 13 people, 9 of them law enforcement officers, while crossing back and forth across Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Iowa. The killings were not planned. They were the consequence of botched robberies and surprise encounters with police. They were photographed together with stolen Browning automatic rifles in poses that newspapers across the country reprinted on their front pages. On May 23, 1934, 6 lawmen ambushed their stolen Ford on a rural road in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. The lawmen fired 167 rounds into the car in roughly 15 seconds. Both Bonnie and Clyde were dead before the firing stopped. The Bonnie and Clyde archetype is the joint criminal couple. Neither one would have committed the killings alone. Together, they could not stop. Couple 2. Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck, the Lonely Hearts Killers. Fernandez was a Spanish-American grifter with a head injury from a falling hatch that he believed had given him voodoo powers over women. He answered Lonely Hearts classified ads in pulp magazines, romanced widowed and single women across the post-war Northeast, defrauded them of their savings, and disappeared. In 1947, he met Martha Beck, a 200-pound former nursing school graduate from Pensacola, through one of those same ads. Within months, she had quit her job, left her children with relatives, and moved in with him. She posed as his sister. Together, they ran the Lonely Hearts Con on widowed women across the post-war American Northeast. But in their version, the women did not just lose their money, they were murdered. The two were arrested in February 1949 for the killing of a 38-year-old widow named Janet Fay in Albany, New York, and her 66-year-old replacement, a Michigan widow named Delphine Downing, whose 2-year-old daughter Raynell was drowned by Beck in the bathtub 3 days later. They were convicted in 1949 of 3 murders, though they confessed to as many as 17. On March 8, 1951, both were executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing, less than 90 minutes apart. The Fernandez and Beck archetype is the con artist couple. The relationship was the cover for the crime. Couple 3. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, the Moors murderers. Brady was a Glaswegian clerk with a documented obsession with the Marquis de Sade and Adolf Hitler. Hindley was a Manchester typist who had grown up Catholic. They met in 1961 when she took a job at the chemical supply firm where he worked. By July 1963, he had read her into his ideology. Their first victim was 16-year-old Pauline Reed, abducted on her way to a dance hall and buried on Saddleworth Moor outside Manchester. Over the next 2 years, they would kidnap and murder John Kilbride, 12, Keith Bennett, 12, Leslie Ann Downey, 10, and Edward Evans, 17. The killing of Leslie Ann Downey was tape recorded by Brady on Christmas Eve, 1964, a recording that would play in full in open court at their 1966 trial. They were arrested on October 7, 1965, after Hindley's 17-year-old brother-in-law witnessed Brady murder Edward Evans with a hatchet and called the police. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment on May 6, 1966. Brady was declared criminally insane and transferred to a psychiatric hospital in 1985. Hindley died in custody in 2002. Brady died in 2017. He never told investigators where Keith Bennett's body was buried. The Brady and Hindley archetype is the ideological couple. He had the worldview, she executed it.
Couple 4. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, the Hillside Stranglers. They were first cousins. Bianchi, 26, was a security guard who had been rejected from the Los Angeles Police Department 3 times. Buono, 43, was a Glendale upholsterer who already had a domestic violence record stretching back to the 1960s. Bianchi moved from Rochester, New York to Los Angeles in 1977 and into his cousin's house. Within months, they had begun working together. Posing as off-duty police officers, they kidnapped young women off Los Angeles streets, sex workers, students, a 12-year-old, a Glendale Community College student, raped, tortured, and strangled them at Buono's upholstery shop, then dumped the bodies on hillsides above the city. 10 women died between October 1977 and February 1978. The killings paused suddenly. Bianchi had moved north to Bellingham, Washington, where he murdered 2 more women alone in January 1979. He was arrested 4 days later. To avoid the death penalty in Washington, he agreed to testify against Buono. The Los Angeles County trial of Angelo Buono, at the time the longest criminal trial in American history, convicted him on 9 counts in 1983. Buono died in custody in 2002. Bianchi remains imprisoned in Washington. The Bianchi and Buono archetype is the family criminal couple. Blood relation, not romance, made the partnership possible.
Couple 5. Leonard Lake and Charles Eng, the Calaveras County Killings. Lake was a Vietnam veteran with a documented obsession with the apocalypse and the construction of a personal sex slave compound he called Operation Miranda, named after the John Fowles novel. Eng was a Hong Kong-born Marine corporal who had served time in Leavenworth for stealing weapons. They had met in 1982 through a survivalist newsletter. By 1983, Eng had moved into Lake's cabin in Wilseyville in the Sierra Nevada foothills of Calaveras County, California. Behind the cabin, on a hillside thick with manzanita, Lake had built a concrete bunker. Between 1983 and June 1985, the two abducted, sexually tortured, and murdered at least 11 people in the bunker, including women, a male friend named Paul Costner, a married couple and their 2-year-old son, and an entire family with an infant daughter. They videotaped many of the assaults. The killings ended on June 2, 1985, when Eng was caught shoplifting a vice from a South San Francisco hardware store, and Lake, waiting outside, was identified by a license check. Lake, in San Francisco police custody, swallowed 2 cyanide capsules he had hidden in his shirt collar. He died 4 days later. Eng fled to Canada and was extradited in 1991. He was convicted in 1999 on 11 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He remains on California's death row. The Lake and Eng archetype is the survivalist couple. The crimes were planned around a paranoid ideology and a fixed location. Couple 6. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, the Ken and Barbie Killers.
Bernardo was a college-educated chartered accountant in St. Catharines, Ontario, who had begun raping women in suburban Toronto in 1987. He met Carla Homolka, then 17, at a Toronto restaurant convention in October that year. She was a veterinary clinic technician. He told her, eventually, about the rapes. She did not call the police. On Christmas Eve 1990, Carla drugged her own 15-year-old sister Tammy with halothane stolen from the clinic, watched as Bernardo assaulted her, and recorded the moment on a Sony Handycam. Tammy died before dawn. The death was ruled accidental. The couple married 18 months later. In June 1991, they abducted 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey in Burlington and killed her in their basement. In April 1992, they abducted 15-year-old Kristen French in St. Catharines and killed her over Easter weekend. They videotaped both abductions. The tapes surfaced after Homolka had already agreed to a 12-year plea deal in exchange for testimony against Bernardo. He was convicted of all charges in 1995, given life without parole eligibility for 25 years. She was released in 2005. The Bernardo and Homolka archetype is the dominance-driven couple. The instigator escalated. The accomplice followed. Couple 7. Fred and Rosemary West. The 25 Cromwell Street murders. Fred West was a Gloucester laborer with a brain injury from a teenage motorcycle accident and a documented history of sexual abuse. Rosemary Letts was 15 years old and the daughter of an abusive father when she met Fred in 1968. By 1972, they had married, moved into a 3-story terraced house at 25 Cromwell Street, and begun running a casual sex trade operation out of the property. They had 8 children of their own. Over the next 2 decades, between 1967 and 1987, the couple raped, tortured, and murdered at least 12 young women, most of them lodgers, hitchhikers, and runaways drawn into the house, burying 9 of the bodies under the cellar floor and the backyard patio. Among the victims, Fred's first wife, Catherine, Rena, the couple's own 8-year-old stepdaughter, Charmaine, their 16-year-old daughter, Heather. Heather had been buried under the patio in 1987. The investigation began in February 1994 after a younger daughter, in foster care, told a social worker that her older sister had been buried in the garden. Police excavated the house. On January 1, 1995, in his prison cell in Birmingham, Fred West hanged himself before standing trial. Rosemary West was convicted of 10 counts of murder on November 22, 1995. She was sentenced to 10 life sentences, later upgraded to a whole life order, meaning she will die in prison. The West archetype is the family predator couple. The crime scene was the family home. Some of the victims were the family. 7 couples: Bonnie and Clyde, Fernandez and Beck, Brady and Hindley, Bianchi and Buono, Lake and NG, Bernardo and Homolka, Fred and Rose West. The patterns are not identical, but they cluster. There is almost always an age gap, with the older partner the more dominant. There is almost always one previous history of violence, usually the man's. There is almost always a recording, a photograph, a paper trail kept by the couple themselves as though documentation were part of what they were doing. And there is almost always, in the case file, a moment investigators can point to where the second partner could have stopped, could have called the police, could have walked, could have, in Carla Homolka's case, let her own sister live. Folie à deux is not a moral defense in any of these cases. Every accomplice was tried as a principal, but it is a diagnostic. It is what makes these cases prosecutable as conspiracies. It is, in almost every case file, what investigators must understand before they can close it. These are real cases, real victims, real verdicts, real losses. Sources are listed at the end of this video and in the description below.
If this casework matters to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. New episodes every week.